Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here. In today's video I want to explore a kind of anomaly from the history of fencing, namely the English rapier. Now my interest in this topic comes from its connection to Italian rapier. So as most of you probably know, the rapier and its associated fencing style was imported into England from Italy primarily in the late 16th century. So in that period, basically English fencers were using Italian rapier weapons in an Italianate style. However, the rapier remained in circulation in England for much of the 17th century, and as the 1600s progressed, the English actually developed their own distinct style of rapier. And by style I mean the design of the weapon itself. So as time went on, it really diverged significantly from the Italian model of the same weapon. So we're going to explore this idea in the rest of this video and talk about some possible implications of this. Right, so the first thing we need to discuss is how Italian rapiers progressed over the period. Now I'm going to give a very simplified overview of this complex topic because it's not really the main focus of the video. So I just want to give you some base level information so that we can then compare the English weapons to it. So in the early period of Italian rapier, the most common weapon was some variation of a swept hilt sword like this one. So we're talking about a period from roughly the middle of the 16th to approximately the middle of the 17th centuries. So weapons like this had some combination of sweeping bars and looping rings to protect the hand, and a long, narrow blade. Blades were typically around 42 inches on average, and these weapons weighed an average of 1.3 kilograms, so they were quite heavy. Round about 1640 or 1650, the Italians started moving towards the cup hilt rapier, which is its later form. So obviously the rings and bars have been replaced by a solid shell or cup like this to provide additional protection to the hand. The blades were still long and narrow, actually about the same length as the earlier model, around 42 inches on average. The cup hilt rapiers in Italy were usually a little lighter than the swept hilts, so maybe more like 1.1 or 1.2 kilograms, but only a little lighter. So broadly speaking, it was the same weapon with additional hand protection and just a little bit of weight removed from the blade. Now, let's talk about English rapiers. So as we've already established in the earliest period of rapier fencing, so that is the late 16th century in England, fencers were basically just using Italian weapons. However, during the course of the 17th century, a unique English style developed. So we're going to look at three examples. These have all been taken from this book, which is called Rapiers, an Illustrated Reference Guide. It's by Valentine. It's primarily intended for antiques collectors. However, it does have some useful examples and information in it. So English rapiers are characterized by some particular features. So we'll start off by talking about the hilts and the pommels. So this is our first example. So if you look at the pommel first, English rapiers have these characteristically elongated, kind of slender pommels. There are a few different forms of them, but more or less all elongated. Now, accompanying this, the actual guard of the hilt itself is usually very ornate. So this form looks something like a cup hilt, but with lots of piercings and some inlaid decoration or engravings. So it looks quite intricate, in fact. Now, if we go to our second example, like this, we can see again an elongated pommel and a very well decorated guard, but this time it has a kind of dish form or shape, so a solid circular plate to protect the top of the hand. So these dish-hilted weapons are also pretty common. The third common form we have, excuse me, the third common form we have is this one. So it's a kind of pierced hilt or mesh hilt, for lack of a better description. So you can see it has the overall shape of a cup, but it's very delicate. Lots of kind of lattice work of metal wiring to provide the cup shape. And once again, an elongated pommel, of course. So these weapons are most typically fitted with blades, which are very narrow, even narrower than the Italian ones, and also very long. They usually start at about 42 inches, which is the same as the Italians, of course, but many of them are actually longer than that. And in fact, there are one or two examples in this book which have 48-inch blades. That's right, it's 48 inches just in the blade. That's not counting the handle. That is really long for a single-handed sword. It's actually quite long even by the standards of double-handed swords. Now, perhaps the strangest thing of all is that these weapons with their very long blades are actually very light. So by looking at some examples held in the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds, so go and check their website online for this information. They have good data available there. So the Leeds Armouries people give the weights of these weapons as consistently being less than 1 kilogram, and they're quite often more like 800 or 900 grams. In fact, I even found one example there which weighed, if I remember, 792 grams. That's really feather light for such a long sword. So to sum up then, the English rapiers differ from the Italian equivalents in the 17th century, both aesthetically, but also functionally. So think about it. These weapons are very long, but really narrow. So their cutting power probably would have been greatly reduced, but with a lot of reach. But they're really light. And the hilts are intricate to the extent of being delicate. So to me, this difference in form suggests a difference in function. But we have a problem here. There are only 2 treatises that I know of which were printed in England in the English language in the 17th century. And one is by Joseph Swetnam, published in 1617, I believe. And another, slightly later, is the anonymous Pallas Armata treatise from around 1639, I think. And both of these treatises describe Italian-derived fencing with the rapier. In Swetnam's case, it looks to me to be drawing to some extent on the Di Grassi and Saviolo tradition, which makes sense as those treatises were definitely in circulation in England the generation before Swetnam published. Pallas Armata, on the other hand, looks to me to be more derived from the early 17th century Italian works by people like Giganti, maybe Capoferro, and quite possibly Fabris. So some of the postures and actions described in Pallas Armata do remind me of Salvatore Fabris' approach. So these two English treatises both make explicit use of Italian fencing terminology. So they're clearly deriving their principles from Italian sources. The books do also have their quirks, so they're not direct copies of the Italians. So there are some important differences as well. But I'm not sure what to make of all this. We have these quite different English rapiers, but being used in an Italianate way. So I'm not really sure what's going on there. But just to emphasize the amount of difference here, that light sword I was telling you about, 792 grams, that is basically half the weight of the heaviest of the Italian swords. Half the weight. I mean, it must have handled so differently from the Italian weapons. So yeah, who knows what was going on there. Now there's one final piece of the puzzle. According to this book, and also according to many modern museum catalogues, these English rapiers are often dated from a surprisingly early era. So some of them are dated as 1620, 1630 is quite a common date, 1640-ish, starting to sound maybe more plausible to me. But I find it really hard to associate these very baroque, very intricate weapons with the early part of the 17th century. To me, it just doesn't really seem to fit. To my eye, they look like they're actually late 17th century weapons, but that's not what the museum curators seem to be saying. So I don't really know the answer to all of this. Perhaps the English were somehow deriving their hilt designs more from Spain than from Italy in that period, and the Spanish apparently did develop the cup hilt a little bit before the Italians, so that might be one possibility. But who knows? So one final point to finish on is I wonder, and this is very speculative, but I wonder if these English designs of rapier are perhaps the origin of some of the misconceptions that researchers from the English-speaking world have about these swords. These rapiers, the examples we've analysed today, they are excessively long and they don't look to me to be particularly robust. Now, many of the classic criticisms from the Anglosphere, if you like, of the rapier are that it's too long to draw conveniently, that it can't cut effectively because the blade's not designed for it, that it's clumsy, that you can't take it on military campaign because it'll just fall apart, etc., etc. Now, these descriptions, to me, actually do match the English rapier designs that we've analysed. But in fact, they do not match the Italian designs. The Italian swords are, for the most part, quite robust. And they're long, but not excessively long. And they're not light weapons per se, so I don't think they would fall apart in a military situation. So there you go. That's kind of my my summary of the topic. And I'm just left wondering if the dating of these English swords is perhaps wrong and is maybe a hangover from late 19th century Victorian historians, maybe ascribing the wrong years to these weapons. I don't really know. So yeah, there isn't really a conclusion to this video today. It's just an interesting puzzle to explain to you and to put out there perhaps for further discussion. We found it interesting and it is fascinating to think about this. So a difference in form of a weapon usually implies a difference in use. So how were the English doing things differently from the Italians, and when exactly did they decide to make the split? All right, I'll finish on that note. Take care, everyone. See you soon. Bye.